Well, good evening, everybody. It's so lovely to see you all here tonight for our very first lecture in honor of the new exhibition, New Beginnings, an American Story of Romantics and Modernists in the West. So without further ado, I want to bring Davison Koenig up to the podium. I believe he needs no introduction to most of you in the audience, but I have to laud a few of his accomplishments first. So Davison is the executive director and curator of the Couse-Sharp Historic Site, which has newly opened its beautiful Lunder Research Center. We were very honored to get an early tour of that, and it is an exquisite space, so congratulations on that. Davison holds an MFA in Museum Exhibition Planning and Design, and a Bachelor of Anthropology of Art as well. His talk tonight is going to be looking into the artistic import of Taos, and I can't wait to hear more. Thanks, Davison.
Well, it's wonderful to see so many friendly faces in the crowd. So thanks a lot for coming out on this Wednesday night. I'm sure there were lots of other things going on in Taos tonight, so I appreciate it. So it's an honor to be here. It's an honor to be here as part of the New Beginnings exhibition, arguably one of the finest painting exhibitions ever assembled of New Mexico art. So I just want to say thank you to the TIA Collection for assembling such an exquisite collection, keeping it in New Mexico, and sharing it with us. And what's also fun for me, and of course the Harwood hosting this fabulous exhibition for all of us, is I was actually one of the speakers when the show opened at the Booth Museum some 2 years ago before the pandemic. So it's really an honor for me to be able to be here in our home and welcome this show back to Taos. Is pretty great. So thank you guys. Do we want to dim the lights a little? Yeah. So we gratefully acknowledge Taos Pueblo, on whose ancestral homelands we gather, as well as the diverse and vibrant Native communities who make their home here today. I would also like to offer a disclaimer that today's talk will only offer a glimpse into the Anglo-centric art world and barely scratch the surface of the important indigenous artistic traditions stretching back several millennia here in Taos. And I also got to say, we're barely going to scratch the surface on the Anglo-centric art world because there's just way too many talented artists here, either living in Taos, passing through New Mexico. So this is going to be a, real, some ways, brief survey. I kind of call it Taos Art 101 because it's just, this is, we're getting there, but there's a lot. So this is one of my favorite quotes. Most of you recognize it from my email if you've corresponded with me, but I have yet to find a better quote that kind of summarizes Taos. For a tiny hinterland community that has never heard the whistle of a train, Taos's impact has been exceeded by few metropolitan communities. Frank Waters. And it's nice to get Frank in there. Taos Society of Artists, TSA for short, left a profound artistic and social legacy. Inspired by the light, landscape, culture, and people of Taos, these 12 artists shared their skills and resources to achieve together an impact that far outweighs what they could have accomplished as individuals. They were both drivers and beneficiaries of social and economic factors that created a new zeitgeist in early 20th century America. Their shared vision of creating a uniquely American art forever influenced not only the world of art, but also prevailing perceptions of Native America and the West. So I'll just introduce some of the gang there, right? We got Martin Hennings on the left, Walter Ufer, Mr. Buck Dutton, Victor Higgins, Ken Adams, Bert Phillips, Irving Couse, Oscar Burninghouse, Henry Sharp, Ernest Blumenschein, and not pictured are Julius Rolshoven, and thankfully we have at least one woman in the crowd, Catherine Critcher. So, first question, why Taos? Taos is special. Taos is bathing in the ethereal autumnal light of aspens and cottonwoods. Taos is a geometric rhythm in the mountains. Ernest Blumenschein. Taos is afternoon shadows slowly climbing the sun-baked adobe walls. Mr. Henry Sharp, and that's the view from his former home, now the Lunder Research Center, looking down Kit Carson our way. Yeah, that was the 1930s, okay? Not that long ago. Taos is a full moon illuminating the Rio Fernando de Taos. I love Caus's nocturnes, are pretty exquisite. Taos is an expansive sky with monsoon clouds building in the late afternoon, just as they are today. Fingers crossed. And I love hearing Dean Porter talk about when he first arrives in New Mexico, and he's been studying, what was he studying? Baroque, studying medieval art. And he gets on this slight bend of Taos, so he says he's got to come out to New Mexico and actually visit. And he swore that Victor Higgins was just making this stuff up, as were the other artists. And he steps off of the plane in Albuquerque and sees those clouds. Sorry. It's I'm just a little thirsty. This is the Taos that drew the Anglo artists to this remote New Mexico valley and continues to bring people to Taos today. They came for the awe-inspiring Taos Valley, the mercurial quality of light, the colorful native pageantry, and a rhythm of life dictated by changing seasons and long-standing tradition. They also benefited from and appreciated the openness to outside cultures and ideas. Taos was a center of trade long before and after the Spanish Entrada of 1598. Besides the commercial trade in pottery, textiles, beadwork, fur, whiskey, came the exchange of ideas, fertile ground for artists. In other important art colonies of the 19th and early 20th centuries, such as Gloucester, Provincetown, Old Mystic, my town, Old Lyme, Carmel, members would spend an idyllic summer painting safe in their artistic bubble and return to their real lives at the end of the season. Initially, most of the TSA came just for the summers as well, although Phillips became a resident immediately after the fateful broken wagon wheel accident that stranded him in Blumenschein so serendipitously. And at this point, I probably should provide a little more context on that broken wagon wheel story, just because we've all heard it a lot. But there's some other important parts of that wagon wheel story that don't get nearly enough press. One, Henry Sharp was the first of the later Anglo artists to visit Taos in 1893, runs into Blumenschein and Phillips in Paris while they're studying at Académie Julian in 1895, tells them about the wonders of Taos in northern New Mexico, which is what initially sets him on the odyssey from Denver to Mexico City as it was planned. And of course, they break down just north of town. They flip a coin. Blumenschein unluckily rides to town with a wagon wheel over his shoulder. Bert Phillips sits up on the hilltop and he's hand-rolling cigarettes watching the clouds pass. And that sets him on the course. But the other part of the story that's seldom told is after they discover the wonders of Taos that summer, which, by the way, Henry Sharp was in Taos 2 weeks before they arrived. Just saying. But of course, they didn't have phones like ours. They couldn't communicate that quickly. But what's really important is that summer, Bert Phillips meets Rose Martin, Doc Martin's sister, right? They fall madly in love, right? And so at the end of the summer, Blumenschein heads back to New York in his career. Bert Phillips stays, but who's to say he would have remained in Taos if it wasn't that he fell in love with Rose Martin, married within the year, and had the foundation of Doc Martin's family in Taos, and he becomes the anchor for the art community. So I posit once again, a woman is to blame. Just saying. But gradually, the 12 stayed longer and longer. They created a community amongst themselves that could sustain itself in a remote part of the country, both intellectually and economically. And perhaps more importantly, the artists became part of the larger community. Together, they sought to capture what they initially observed around them, but as they became enmeshed in the lives of their neighbors, their indigenous neighbors, they began to paint what they saw, but with greater depth, born of greater knowledge and experience. Phillips wrote to Blumenschein during his first weeks in Taos, "There is scarcely a day, but at least 2 or 3 Indians are here, and I really like them and enjoy having them around. Their friendship is sincere, and they appreciate the way we treat them as equals." Ben Lujan posed for Couse for decades and brought his wife and children to model as well. His son attested that Ben considered the Couses his adopted parents. Virginia Couse, Irving Couse's wife, who was also an artist and studied in Paris at the Académie Julian, taught Ben the rudiments of reading and writing, and they worked together to create the first decorative garden in Taos. After the artist died, Ben continued to work for the Couse family, and according to Couse's granddaughter, Virginia Couse Levitt, he was a surrogate father for my brother, my sister, and me. When we spent summers in Taos as children, some of Ben's grandchildren still use Couse as a middle name. Such relationships with the Taos community were significant in the TSA's artistic development and still matter today. And I love that photograph of Ginny's brother Irv in the wheelbarrow with Ben rolling him out of the studio door. How did these artists in an isolated town become so influential? To move to Taos meant giving up your galleries, patrons, and the social life that supported your career. It helped that the TSA period was also the height of the arts and crafts movement. Native American arts and depictions of Native people fit perfectly into this philosophy, against an increasingly mechanized and mass-produced culture. It was all the rage to create an Indian curio corner in the home, and department stores such as John Wanamaker's and Marshall Field's displayed Navajo textiles, Apache baskets, and Pueblo pottery for sale in the windows. Most importantly, the TSA promoted their work through traveling exhibitions. The artists themselves organized, curated, and shipped their shows around the country, leveraging the connections of the whole group. While these shows were not always financially successful in the short term, the initiative exposed their shared vision of America to a national audience. Note, the exhibitions often included TSA associate members Robert Henry, Albert Grohl, John Sloan, Randall Davey, B.J.O. Norfeld, Birger Sanson, and Gustav Baumann. You know, this is a pretty heady group of artists, all coming out of the East Coast. In addition, the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway, along with entrepreneur Fred Harvey, marketed the Southwest to increase travel. William Haskell Simpson, the railroad's advertising agent, found in the TSA a perfect look for the Santa Fe brand, and multiple members of the TSA found important sales and priceless advertising of their work. Simpson purchased paintings to display in train depots and to feature in the popular Santa Fe Railway calendars. Couse alone provided art for 23 of those calendars. Imagine going in train depots now and seeing, just masterworks on the walls. Another avenue of popular culture that did well by the TSA was illustrated magazines such as Harper's Weekly, McClure's, Scribner's, Century. Outside of museums, this is where the average American experienced art. Many of the TSA provided illustrations and wrote articles on their travels in the West, often in exchange for railway tickets and the opportunity to travel and paint. All these strands together created a sort of popular cultural juggernaut with the Taos Society of Artists at the center. While these paintings today may seem rather conventional and even a romanticized vision of America, but during their day, it is important to note where they came from. During the early 20th century, American art was just beginning to emerge from a traditional academic painting style that featured landscapes drenched in browns and greens, with people often depicted as tiny dots. Portraits were deep in shadow. And there we see the Schuylkill River. The work of the TSA was radically different at the time. A TSA exhibition was filled with intense light, color, mystery, indigenous artwork, and depictions of people in daily life quite different from both big city ways and the Wild West portrayals then well known. This amounted to a new exciting vision of America. And I like this example, right? We see Couse, 1901, while he's staying at his wife's family's ranch along the Columbia River. Here's his palette in 1901, and then look where he is in 1910. The Taos Society of Artists weren't the only painters of the period with a refreshingly colorful palette depicting the West, but they were doing it as a group with a shared vision and a unique lived perspective of the American West. The TSA were academically trained representational artists, but were open to new ideas themselves. All demonstrated modernist leanings to varying degrees, whether Impressionism, Art Nouveau, Fauvism, Expressionism, or Cubism. The artists were exposed to most all the isms while studying in Europe and upon their return to America. Later, Andrew Dosberg and other ardent modernists began to migrate to Santa Fe and Taos beginning in the teens. And it's during this period that American popular culture's exposure to Native Americans, in addition to the illustrated monthly magazines, was largely through dime novels of dubious accuracy and Buffalo Bill's Wild West showcase of stereotype and misinformation. Artists such as Charlie Russell and Frederick Remington largely depicting a passing mythic West, cowboys and Indians forever engaged in an epic struggle for America's manifest destiny. The TSA, on the other hand, depicted the integrity of Native people in activities of daily life, domestic tranquility, agrarian work, contemplative moments, and ceremonial obligations. Quite simply, their depictions deeply influenced people's perceptions of the West and of Native people. The Pueblo models, by posing for their artists, became not merely passive sitters, but agents of social change. Through their portrayals and depictions, and most importantly, their relationships with the artist. And this piece is in the exhibition. If you haven't seen it, this is certainly one of Henry Sharp's master works. That's Cruzita Mondragon of Taos Pueblo, and it's just a little exquisite. Henry Sharp writes, "I try to present the Indian as he is, mentally as well as physically, not as ephemeral fiction has delighted to picture him, but as a human being endowed with intelligence, swayed by nobility of thought, animated by craftiness, or calmed by reveries of bygone days." Forced relocation, boarding schools, and numerous other official and unofficial government tactics combined to damage or destroy indigenous cultures. As TSA's members' interactions with their native models deepened, so too did their understanding of the inequity of federal Indian policy. Through their artwork, letters, and lobbying, the artists became advocates for native rights and sovereignty. And that's a great little snapshot, right, from Carlisle, arguably the most notorious of the boarding schools. Sometimes the social commentary in their work is more overt, such as Blumenshine's provocative piece, Superstition, a direct response to a 1921 ruling that denied Native people the right to practice their ceremonies. More often, though, the artwork's message is subtle, conveying shared human values and psychological depth. Even the more romanticized pieces speak to the complexity, subtlety, and worth of the region's cultures and people. The artists were also quite aware of their problematic role as Anglo-Americans depicting Native American people and culture, and were not above self-deprecation. Here we see Walter Ufer being challenged by his model Jim Mirabal's wife, and it just demonstrates that these were not always halcyon moments being captured on canvas. But I just love that Ufer, how long did it take him to paint that painting of this moment that he felt was necessary to record? And that's my favorite self-portrait of Hoofer is kind of great. And he's just like, nope, I'm not backing down. The Taos Society of Artists disbanded in 1927, having largely outlived its usefulness, as the artists had become household names and their town had become synonymous with great art. Taos became a draw for collectors and cultural tourists. Artists and writers began to flock to the area, many at the invitation of socialite and Taos patroness, Mabel Dodge Lujan. That's just a great Dunton. Heiress and art patroness Mabel Dodge was at the forefront of the avant-garde in Paris and New York. She helped organize the 1913 Armory Show in New York, introducing modernism to America. Mabel came to Taos with artist husband Maurice Stern in 1918, and she stated later in life she was drawn to the Southwest in part by E.I. Cous's paintings. She brought some of the greatest writers, thinkers, and artists of the day to Taos. Shortly after her arrival, she met Antonio Lujan from Taos Pueblo. Subsequently divorcing Maurice, she married him in 1923, and in taking his name in typical Mabel fashion, she, changed that J to an H because all of her friends were having trouble pronouncing Lujan. Kind of telling. Within weeks of her arrival in Taos, Mabel convinced Andrew Dosberg to board a train heading west because she was actually looking for a cook. And she asked Andrew if he would find a cook and travel with said cook to help her in Taos. Dosberg was one of the leading avant-garde artists in the country, having participated in the Armory Show and numerous modern art shows in New York. On his first visit in 1918, Dosberg was captivated by the Native American and Hispano arts. An ardent admirer of Cezanne's work, he was one of the first to champion the challenges of New Mexico's luminous light, vast landscape, and organic architecture in a wholly modernist approach. He settled in Taos in 1933 and becomes one of the most significant anchors for the modernist movement there. And that picture of him is just one of my favorite artist photographs ever because he just looks so dashing. It makes you want to become an artist. He attracts many artists to Taos, including Kenneth Adams, who later joins the TSA, Ward Lockwood, Howard Cook, Katie Wells, Barbara Latham, and Earl Stroh, to name a few. Because of his draw and influence on other artists, he becomes arguably the single most important artist in Taos during his lifetime. And his artistic career spans a very long time. Just as the light landscape and the colorful traditions of the native inhabitants fueled the TSA, it also provided endless inspiration for the modernist movement. And I hope everyone saw that Marjorie Eaton show that was at the Fechin House, Taos Art Museum, a couple of years ago, because that was amazing, amazing. One of my favorite shows in town. The desert itself was the definition of minimalist, Earl Stroh. The rhythmic dance of Pueblo ceremonies was repetitive by design, Howard Cook. The purity of light revealed geometric patterns in the landscape, Katie Wells. Yeah, and that's 1938, right? An entirely new landscape and culture challenged the immigrant artist to rethink representation. Barbara Latham. And how to visually integrate layers of meaning. And here we have Ward Lockwood getting pretty much everything in one painting. Also, the abundant native and Hispano material culture, minimalist Navajo, Pueblo, and Rio Grande weavings, abstract designs on Pueblo pottery, folk carvings and paintings of the Catholic saints all became the inspiration for an artistic outpouring from northern New Mexico that arguably is unmatched by any region in North America, I would say. Marston Hartley arrived at Mabel Dodge Lujan's in 1918 with the express purpose of creating an authentically American art. Sound familiar? a popular modernist mantra, precisely the same call to action by the TSA. In a letter to Alfred Stieglitz, photographer and New York gallerist who was a prime mover of modernism in America, a month before his New Mexico arrival states, he is seeking an open space for my eyes to regain their vision and my mind to feel itself free again. He paints a series of works based on Hispano-religious art, native ceremonials, and the limitless landscape. These initial visual impressions seared in his psyche would inform many of his most compelling canvases for years, although painted later in New York and Berlin. And it's interesting, Marsden actually can't stand New Mexico after a couple weeks. Doesn't like the weather, doesn't like the people, doesn't like the light. But it ends up, those next 4 years, the bulk of his work is New Mexico. He can't get it out of his psyche. And so he's painting these really compelling pieces largely from memory. D.H. Lawrence and wife Frida, who come to Mabel's in 1922, later living in a ranch north of Taos, after a stint in Mexico, they returned in 1924 with the Honorable Dorothy Brett. While Lawrence only spends a total of 11 months in Taos, he later wrote, "I think New Mexico was the greatest experience I ever had from the outside world. It certainly changed me forever." I love that quote, from the outside world, right? So what's his inside world? Like, that's just interesting. I don't think it was easy being D.H. Lawrence. In 1927, also at the invitation of Mabel, and the encouragement of artist John Young Hunter, who settles in Taos in 1942, Nikolai Fechin and family travel to Taos. Soon, Nikolai begins building and hand-carving a uniquely Russian New Mexico fusion home and studio that is now the Taos Art Museum. And Fechin is the single most internationally known of all the artists of Taos. And that was something I just recently came to that realization. It was like, wow, that's kind of fascinating. Like, we live in Taos. Fechin is definitely one of our single most important artists, but from an international perspective, he is better known than probably any other artist of Taos during that period, because he was a really big deal in Europe and in Russia, and still is. But I love that. That's the best portrait of Mabel. I mean, he just kind of nails all of that Mabelness in one portrait. Fechin was not the only Russian-born artist in Taos. Leon Gaspard arrived in 1918 and was soon befriended by Herbert Buck Dunton. Dunton serves as Gaspard's trout fishing guide in exchange for critiques of his work. Georgia O'Keeffe and artist friend Rebecca Beck Salisbury Strand, at the invitation of Mabel, spend the summer with her in 1929. Shortly after her arrival, Rebecca wrote her photographer husband, Paul Strand, "Georgia and I giggle when we think about everything and can't get over how simple this kind of living is. How much greater the opportunity to work without all the distractions the city seems to make inevitable. We are both as active and alive as a couple of fillies, and it is a grand feeling." I just love how much more fun language used to be. But what's important there, let me go back. Hold on. Is in that statement is contained a lot in that a lot of women artists migrate to New Mexico and Taos in particular because of that freedom offered by the West. The East Coast was so many social constraints and expectations of a woman, and being an artist didn't really fit into those constraints. And so, as you'll see in this presentation, there's a lot of really talented women artists, disproportionate number here in New Mexico during that period. O'Keeffe responds immediately to her new surroundings, creating some of her most iconic images during her stay with Mabel. And of course, this is the cross behind Mabel's house at the Murata. While simultaneously, Rebecca Salisbury James, now divorced from Paul Strand and married to William James of Taos, perfects her compelling reverse painting on glass images, for which she becomes renowned. And yeah, I was just talking with Christian. She's just one of my favorite artists. I absolutely find her work just beguiling. You just have to stand in front of it for a while. And this one really was one of my favorites. I don't know if it's still at Parsons, but it was there for a while. But if it's there, you really should go see it. Freed from the social constraints of the East Coast, a significant number of important I already went over that. Freed from the social constraints of the East Coast, a significant number of important women artists find their way to Taos, beginning with the TSA member, Catherine Critcher. Mary Blumenschein, Ernest's wife, who also studied in Paris in 1902, became only the second American woman to receive a gold medal at the Salon following Mary Cassatt. Yeah, that's kind of a big deal. It does make you wonder. Dorothy Brett, Isla McAfee, Blanche Grant. At O'Keeffe's suggestion, Mabel invited watercolorist John Marin to come to Taos in 1929. After initially pronouncing the task of painting the vastness of northern New Mexico impossible, with the help of trout fishing expeditions accompanied by Dorothy Brett, Andrew Dosberg, and Ward Lockwood, he begins to paint, producing over 100 watercolors over the summers of 1929 and 1930, creating landscape paintings that will inspire Taos modernists for decades to come and continue to inspire, right? So this is 1930. So John Marin's one of the first ones to really deconstruct the landscape and reassemble it and make it make sense and actually demonstrate how it can be done, and becomes an inspiration for a lot of folks, including Andrew Dosberg. Thanks in part to Tony Lujan's efforts, Ansel Adams is able to photograph Taos Pueblo. Adams first visits Mabel in 1927, where he meets author Mary Austin, who invites him to collaborate on Taos Pueblo portfolio, which becomes a career-altering moment for Adams. Adams returns in 1929 and 1930, and it is at this point in his career that he makes the transition from concert pianist to professional photographer, right? Taos, just saying. During this period, Paul Strand creates some of the more compelling images of Taos, including the iconic San Francisco de Asís church at Ranchos de Taos, the most photographed church in North America. By the way, the picture gold tone platinum here fetched $106,000 at auction in 2016. That's pretty good for a photograph, but it is that good. In 1925, Jean Claus and her poet husband, Philip Claus, honeymooned in Taos. By 1929, they are spending every summer in Taos. In 1935, she was one of 3 Taos artists who represented New Mexico at a Paris exhibition titled 3 Centuries of Art in the United States. Claus's highly evocative work becomes synonymous with Taos, capturing people, ceremonies, and landscape with her signature high-contrast etching style. Yeah, I mean, you see a Jean Claus across the room, you know it's Jean Claus. 1931, Maynard Dixon and his wife, photographer Dorothea Lange, leave San Francisco at the invitation of Mabel, who offers Dixon studio space. During their 7th-month stay in Taos, Dixon produces 40 paintings. I did not know that. So someday we need a Maynard Dixon Taos show. And Dorothea Lange, her poignant commentary on rural America in the depths of the Great Depression. Also would be another good show. 1933, Edward Weston visits Mabel and writes, "I have some fine new work, landscapes with gorgeous heavens. For in New Mexico, the heavens and earth become one." I would have to agree. But that's stunning. In 1931, Hispano artist Patrocinio Barella is asked to repair a 19th century Spanish bulto, or sculpture of a saint, and he has an epiphany to carve figures from a single block of wood. Thus begins his lifelong spiritual exploration of the human condition through semi-abstract forms. He receives short-lived recognition in the Federal Arts Project's 1936 exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, titled New Horizons in America Art, with the New York Times calling him an artist of real force, and Time magazine calling him the discovery of the year. Tragically, he dies in a studio fire at the age of 64. However, his legacy has been well preserved, especially here at the Harwood, and is acknowledged to be the first Hispano artist to receive such national recognition. And as many of you know, his descendants are carrying on that tradition today with some pretty impressive carvings. Emil Bistrom settles in Taos in 1932. He quickly asserts himself alongside Dosberg as another anchor of the art community. He organizes the Taos County Mural Project through the WPA, hiring Victor Higgins, Bert Phillips, and Ward Lockwood. That same year, he founds Taos's first contemporary art gallery and the Bistrom School of Art. And I love that Hopi snake dancer, which was just at auction this last year, that Santa Fe art auction. That's just amazing. In 1938, he and Raymond Janssen co-found the Transcendental Painting Group, a purely modernist movement. They were striving to communicate a vision of eternal truths, to carry, in Bistrom's words, to carry painting beyond the appearance of the physical world through new concepts of space, color, light, and design to imaginative worlds that are idealistic and spiritual. And there was just an amazing show at the Albuquerque Museum this last year. They had successful shows in San Francisco in 1939 and at the Guggenheim and Museum of Modern Art in New York in 1940. But what's really significant is that this is a new modernist abstract movement coming out of not coming out of New York or San Francisco, but coming out of New Mexico, coming out of Taos and largely Albuquerque. It's pretty impressive. Established New York artists Beatrice Mandelman and Louis Reebok arrive in 1944. They quickly become an important hub in the artistic and social scene, embracing Andrew Dosberg, Thomas and Dorothy Ben Remo, Mabel Dodge Lujan, and serve as a link to the early artists of Taos, including members of the TSA and Leon Gaspard. Reebok and Mandelman travel the region, finding inspiration painting in Navajo country and attending Indian ceremonials throughout Arizona and New Mexico. And I just love this photograph of the two of them, right? They're just 1944 and they are taking on the world. Together, Mandelman and Reebok help usher in a new era of modern art in Taos and form the nucleus of what will become known as the Taos Moderns. Following on the heels of World War II, veterans are anxious to make up for lost time and take advantage of the GI Bill. Charles Stewart Jr., having served with General George S. Patton in 5 campaigns, hitchhikes and travels by bus to Taos, enrolling in Louis Reebok's Taos Valley Art School in 1947. By Stewart's estimate, between Reebok's school, located in Walter Ufer's former studio, Emil Bistrom's school, and the UNM Summer Field School, nearly 100 veterans had enrolled in Taos on the GI Bill. 100 veterans. That's a lot of folks studying, right? So artistic theory, production, dialogue, all of that happening here in Taos. By the early, such diverse talents in philosophies of Dosberg, Reebok, Bistrom, and surviving members of the TSA offer critiques to young artists and make Taos an eclectic place to study. By the early 1950s, Taos was home to modernists Edward Corbett, Clay Spoon, Katie Wells, Earl Stroh, Alfred Rogaway, Cliff Harmon, Thomas E. and Dorothy Ben Remo, Malcolm Brown, Ted Egri, Agnes Martin, John Dupuy, Michael Klein, Joseph Glasgow, Louis Gontier, and many others. But yeah. And by the 1950s, outside of New York and San Francisco, Taos was one of the most important centers for serious artistic study, exploration, and production. In this unlikely cauldron of creativity that began at the turn of the last century, artists and intellectuals from around the world could meet new friends with whom to talk theory, critique each other's work, and challenge themselves and their peers. Finding inspiration in a remote desert landscape, they were witness to and participants of a rich cultural community with a rhythm of life dictated by changing seasons and long-standing traditions. Some came only for a brief period, but the majority stayed. As executive director and curator of the Couse-Sharp historic site, I believe we're doing our part to preserve and share this important artistic legacy. Our 2.5-acre site features the home studios, gardens, and collections of E.I. Couse and J.H. Sharp, and we are well on our way to expanding that vision further. We have built an archive and research center devoted to the Taos Society of Artists and early Taos art. Sharp's former home is now a 5,000 square foot museum facility named the Lunder Research Center, which contains archival storage, collection storage, a research library, curatorial, office, and exhibition space. We are committed to making these collections, archives, and stories accessible to scholars, artists, and the general public. We currently have 2 summer interns, PhD candidates from the University of Oklahoma and University of Texas, El Paso, who are in the audience tonight, and a Colby College postgraduate fellow joining us next week. We are planning scholar-in-residence and artist-in-residence programs. We look forward to serving a wider audience and bringing this Taos legacy to life. I hope you will come pay us a visit if you have not as of late, and support us in this important endeavor. And I also want to mention we have a fabulous new exhibition that just opened last week, Javon Lee's The Infinite Landscape, which really is more of an installation exhibition than a typical painting show, and it's just kind of a gorgeous space to come and while away an afternoon. But Javon Lee's a great example of, the next generation of artists interpreting our Taos Valley and allowing us to look at that light landscape differently. So that's it. Thank you, folks. And I do want to point out that photograph is probably my favorite Henry Sharp photograph, right? It's Jerry Mirabal taking a cigarette break and critiquing the painting of himself by Henry Sharp. But to me, that speaks volumes about the story of Taos and those relationships. So yeah, I'd love to take some questions. Anyone? Well, that's easy. Okay.
Okay, so I noticed that a lot of the landscapes in this exhibit were of Taos or of Santa Fe, and I was wondering if you could discuss the differences in the artistic developments of the two cities. They both seem so formative in New Mexico's history.
Good question. It's kind of hard to talk about Taos without Santa Fe as much as we like to. But it's really pretty fascinating because they both develop contemporaneously, very similar. Artists being brought from the east, discovering New Mexico, the light, the landscape. The big difference is there's kind of two, with the early artists, they never at the same level formed the organization like the Taos Society of Artists, right? You have to have painted 3 summers. You have to have been shown significant exhibitions, juried shows, and most importantly, there's actually a charter that states that they're promoting the native arts and art education in general. So very focused, and they organize the traveling shows like we talked about, but Santa Fe never organizes on that same level. Now they have the Museum of New Mexico, which organizes them as a group, and in a way organizes all the artists of New Mexico, which is interesting. So that's kind of happening as a parallel at the same time, but different. But the real the biggest difference is probably with the Modernists in that Santa Fe never develops as a center of modernism in the same way Taos does. Partly it was the political climate at the time. What was it? The editor of the newspaper was a McCarthyite pre-McCarthy, and was writing editorials in the newspaper saying that the Modernists were Bolsheviks. So it didn't make a real comfortable climate to be a modernist. And was it John Sloan that was fired from his position?
It was, no, well, we actually have that newspaper article on display in the museum right now.
Nice.
Check it out. But no, it was, I think Sheldon Parsons.
Sheldon Parsons,
like
yeah.
This radical person who's going to
Yeah.
get fired from their job for being a Bolshevik. It's not Sheldon Parsons.
Yeah, and that's Christian, the curator at New Mexico Museum of Art. But yeah, so the political climate was very different. And, Taos, just like it has been for centuries, was just a little more remote, a little rough around the edge, and you could get away with a little more. And so I think, honestly, that's really what made the big difference is, Taos always attracted folks that were, a little different. Santa Fe's the city different? Well, Taos is the town that's a whole lot different. And we kind of revel in that. But yeah, thank you. That's a good question, because it really is interesting how there's so much similar happening at the same time, but very different outcomes of what happens here in Taos, in New Mexico. Anyone else? Yes.
Some people think the Hispano culture was neglected versus the Pueblo culture. Could you talk about that? Was it really, or could you show examples of both?
Yeah, that's tough to say. I think, I think part of it is the cultural climate. Like we talked about, the arts and crafts movement, Native America fits into this box, right? And Hispano culture didn't quite fit into the same box, right? Like, we grow up hearing about, at least on the East Coast, we learn all about the Pilgrims. There's no mention of Spain. Spain's never here. So I think it was a larger cultural conversation in America, that it was just easier to paint Native America. And I think, at the end of the day, you got to sell artwork to survive. But was it conscious? I don't think so. I definitely don't think it was conscious by the artists. And I think the majority of the artists paint everyone in Taos. They're painting the eclectic characters of Taos just as much as they're painting Hispano and Native models. But, this is also, these artists, a lot of them, Henry Sharp, they grow up, with the myth of the American West and Native America, right? So it's like from a young age, they wanted to study Native America and travel out west. And that's a whole different allure than I want to travel out west to meet Hispano culture. So there's a psychology happening, I think, that kind of builds into this. So I would say all those things happening simultaneously, but I would find it hard to believe it was really a conscious thing where they were like, yeah, I'd rather paint Native Americans than Hispano. It was a fascination with the culture, as we see in like the studios. They're filling it with Native American art. They're fascinated by Native American art and the people, obviously. Good question. Anyone else? Yes, sir, in the back row.
You touched a little bit on how they, the Taos Society of Artists would tour these shows and had calendars, all of them having come from like the East Coast or the sort of the new money of the old world, ask any New Yorker. New York is the art and general center of the universe.
Always will be.
Yeah, and then they come out to the Wild West and have their minds blown by everything around them. Did their fame, and as you said, you got to sell paintings. Did that come from sort of going back to these art hubs and saying, you won't believe how amazing things are here? Here's our paintings that we did out here, or was there some other means of, for lack of a better term, making it with the works that they created in Taos?
So, the way they're able to make it in Taos is really because they work together. That's what enables them to live full time in Taos, And that's really the big separation from like any other art colony. That's what makes Taos unique amongst all the national art colonies. Is, yeah, I mean, this was arguably the most remote art colony in North America. There's nowhere else as remote as Taos. So how is it that by the 1920s you have J.D. Rockefeller, Stark, Gilcrease, you know, traveling to Taos with an extra motor car so they can load it up with paintings? Like, that's a big deal in a very short amount of time. And really it's because they did these traveling shows from coast to coast, and they figured out, okay, you know, Buck's from Maine, and, you know, Couse is from Michigan, and, you know, Ufer's from Chicago, and, you know, Sharp's from Cincinnati, and we all have these connections. We have gallery friends, we have museum friends, we have collectors, and if we use all of our connections together, okay, we can arrange a traveling exhibition that goes from coast to coast. And then you're showing, yeah, Robert Henry and Gustav Baumann and Nordfeld and Berger Sanson. All these guys in one room in one exhibition would have just been mind-blowing. You know, now everything is art, right? Thanks to Duchamp, everything's art. It's fabulous. We live in such a liberating art world. Back then, art was in a box. So to see a show like that, I mean, literally would have blown people's minds. And that's what, you know, like I said, they didn't always sell those shows, but it sold them and it sold Taos. I mean, they were the greatest chamber of commerce for Taos. You know, well, they and Mabel. You know, I think she was sponsored by the Chamber of Commerce. I mean, that's what gets them sales, gets them national recognition. But they're also entering in every juried exhibition across the country, right? Chicago, New York, San Francisco, because they still need more recognition. But the other thing that they do, and we mentioned a little bit about this, is they're writing articles for the illustrated magazines. Blumenschein was a great writer. Henry Sharp was a great writer. So they're promoting themselves in magazines, but they're promoting their friends at the same time, which is pretty cool. You know, artists, you know, we tend to work in our world, and we like our artist friends because they're a lot of fun and they critique our work, but we don't necessarily work together to promote each other's work. And that's what the Taos Society of Artists do that's pretty important. And I think that's what generates sales to a large degree, is that self-promotion, but then putting, you know, those caliber of artists painting New Mexico, Santa Fe, Taos together in a room was pretty important. Yes, ma'am.
Could you speak to the impact of the Great Depression
Sure.
on this Taos environment?
Yeah, I mean, you know, the artists were successful, but it wasn't like they were, I mean, none of these artists were millionaires, right? I mean, you come to the Couse House, it's a beautiful home, right? But, yeah, I mean, it was really upper middle class for Taos. But compared to their colleagues who were living in coastal Connecticut or the Hudson River, you know, in post-Victorian clapboard houses with, say, electricity and running water, you know, it's pretty different. So, I'm sorry, back to your question. I totally got lost on plumbing and running water.
The Great Depression.
Oh, the Great Depression. Yeah. So I would say they all struggled. You know, we have letters, you know, from even Henry Sharp, the fastest painter in the West. You know, he had always had so much inventory and he couldn't sell paintings. You know, and they all struggled. I mean, that's why you have, that's why they organized the Taos County murals. You know, and you've got Victor Higgins painting for the WPA. You know, and I think, yeah, and that's a good segue. Come over to the Lunder Research Center. We have my new favorite Victor Higgins painting on display, Neon Moses, that he paints while he's working on the Taos County murals. And I think it was a way for him to kind of blow off steam, because he's like, you know, I'm Victor Higgins, and I'm painting Moses on a mural in the Taos County courthouse, right? And I'm sure he enjoyed it. You know, he got to learn how to do fresco mural. But on the other hand, he's kind of like, I want to be painting. And so I think all of them were definitely challenged. I don't think there were any artists that really were above feeling the Great Depression, and Taos definitely would have felt it, pretty sharply compared to a lot of other economies, because we didn't have a big economy. It wasn't diverse, It's a lot more diverse now, and we complain about how anemic our economy is. Yeah. Any other questions? Yes?
Is the recording of this presentation going to be made available?
Yes. Yep.
How can it be accessed?
We'll put it on our website. We'll put it on our YouTube channel. So we have a number of lectures on there. We have, as YouTube channels go, it's pretty cool. We being Couse-Sharp, yes, to clarify. So if you just go to YouTube and type in Couse-Sharp, a whole lot of lectures and stuff will come up, and we'll be bringing stuff up there periodically. We may not be as quick as everybody, but it will get up there. Yep. Yes.
This is not a question, it's just a statement. I appreciate the emphasis on the women artists. You seldom see that. So I appreciate you mentioning that and showing their artwork.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's an important part of the Western story these artists are coming out here for a reason. It's not just, the beauty of the landscape and the cultural diversity. It's freedom. It's the freedom to be an artist, to be a woman how you want to define being a woman. Like, that's a big deal. So yeah, we see a way disproportionate number of really talented female artists emerging out of New Mexico during this long period. Yes?
In your archives, do you have any information about Ufer's wife and Blumenschein's wife, why they weren't let into the club?
Not that I know of. Gosh, I would love to find some of that. That's kind of what I alluded to earlier, talking about, Helen Blumenschein is like, what if she wasn't married to Ernest?
Well, they didn't let Harwood in either.
Yeah. I'd love to find documentation that discusses that, but I don't know of anything. Do you, Marissa?
No.
I'd love to hear the conversations they were having about Catherine Critcher.
Oh, she had something to offer. She had her own art school on the East Coast.
Yeah, but I think it was more than that. I don't know. It's a really good question. Yes?
Sorry.
On the Blumenstein tour, I heard that he once stated that in his house there would be one artist, and that was him.
I don't know if it's true, but it would not surprise me in the least. Yeah. Ginny says it's true? It's true. And it makes sense, because, she was a very talented artist very early on. So why was she not more prodigious, and why was she not entering in juried shows like everybody else?
Just being a mom.
Yeah, she was busy. And, that may have been her personal decision. Who are we to say? Until we read letters from her or something documenting that, I don't know.
Point of information, Couse's wife was trained in Europe, in France.
Yeah.
And she dropped back as well.
Yeah. As we mentioned, Irving's wife, Virginia, they meet in art school. She's studying at the Female Académie Julian. In the 1880s, she travels alone to study art. So very determined woman to be an artist. She never really pursues that artistic career. Partly she has problems with her vision, but also she puts her creativity into building the garden. She never really pursues her art either. We have very little art in the family from her, which is a shame. I wish we had more examples of her early work, and we just don't. Yes?
I'm one of the lucky Wurlitzer people that stayed in Taos after staying there. And
Nice.
I was just wondering where she figures into this history.
She's later. She figures in later, but she's an important part of that because, she is this next legacy of, in a very different way from Mabel, like stark opposite of Mabel. But she fosters creativity and brings people to Taos to have that space. And yeah, what's exceptional at the Wurlitzer is, it doesn't come with Mabel baggage. It comes with the opposite. It comes with no expectations. So yeah, I mean, Helene in her way carries on that tradition and does today, which is amazing. And quietly does it, which is pretty fabulous. So yeah, no, really good point. And that's also what makes Taos so exceptional, right? Is it's still going on. How many artists here are quietly doing amazing work? You know, what's kind of a shame is a lot of these artists aren't showing in Taos. You know, a lot of our most talented artists are elsewhere because of the economy of art. Hopefully we'll get back to there at some point. We're coming out of the pandemic. We just need a little critical mass of galleries to get Taos back to where it once was. But, you know, we're working on it. We're working on it. Yes, any other questions? All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Appreciate it. Thank you, Glenn.
Thank you, Davison. That was wonderful.